There was a young woman named Esther who lived in Letcher County, Kentucky in 1934. Her boyfriend was a young man named Ezra Jackson, and the couple were very much in love. However, there was an old man who had become obsessed with Esther. He was pestering her all the time and asking her to marry him. She found him repulsive and didn't want anything to do with him. But no matter what she did, she couldn't get him to stop. He was stalking her and she was scared to death. Eventually, she decided that if she had a husband, he might give up and leave her alone. So she married her boyfriend Ezra. After the wedding, as the couple were driving home, the old man suddenly stepped out into the road in front of them. Ezra had to hit the brakes to avoid hitting him. The old man came up to Esther's window and glared in at her. "I'm going to die soon," he growled. "But I'll be back for you, and when I return, you'll go with me." Ezra floored on the accelerator and drove off at a top speed. But Esther was freaked out and couldn't stop thinking about what the old man had said. A few days later, the old man was found dead in his home. His body was buried in the local cemetery. He had no friends or relatives, and anyone who had known him, they were afraid of him, so nobody at all mourned his passing. A year after his death, on a snowy night in December, Esther was sitting in her living room reading a book when there was a knock at the front door. Her husband and his two brothers were in the kitchen. "I'll see who it is," she called to them. The three men heard her open the door, but they didn't hear anyone come in. There were no voices, just an eerie silence. After waiting for a few minutes, they went into the living room and found the door standing wide open. Esther was nowhere to be seen. When they looked outside, they found the tracks of her bare feet in the snow. The three men quickly grabbed their coats and flashlights and set off in search of her. They followed the footprints for about 2 miles along the rough, snow-covered country road until they came to the local cemetery. The footprints led through the gate and right up to the old man's grave, where they vanished. While his two brothers waited in the cemetery, Ezra went to fetch help. He came back with several men from the village. It was midnight and the weather was freezing. But together under the light of the flashlights and lanterns, they began to dig up the grave. When they dragged out the coffin and opened it, they were horrified to discover that it was empty. Although a thorough search was made, no trace of the young wife or the old man's body was ever found. To this day, the disappearance of Esther Jackson remains an unsolved mystery. You know how, on Halloween night, people always gather around the campfire and tell scary stories about strange things lurking in the woods, and nobody believes them? Well, sometime those stories are true. Last year, just before Halloween, I was home watching TV when I heard a knock on the front door. When I went to answer it, I found a dog standing on the front porch. I looked around, but I couldn't see the owner anywhere. The dog seemed to be lost. I wasn't sure what breed he was, but he looked like a Siberian Husky. His tongue was hanging out and he was panting like he was thirsty, so I put out a bowl of water for him. The dog lapped up the whole thing. Ever since I was a little girl, I'd always wanted a pet dog, but my parents would never allow me to have one. I didn't want to bring him inside the house, so I put him in the backyard. I gave him some leftovers to eat, but he just turned up his nose at them and refused to touch anything. That evening, when my parents came home, I told them about the lost dog. At first, they told me I would have to get rid of it, but after much begging and pleading, they told me I could keep it. However, they didn't want it inside the house. My mother was allergic to dogs. The dog slept in the garden shed. In the middle of the night, I woke up and looked out my bedroom window. I could see the dog's glowing eyes in the darkness. It seemed like he was just standing there, staring up at me. It gave me a very eerie feeling. The next day was Halloween. In the morning, I went to the store and bought a can of dog food. When I got home, I opened it up and put it into a bowl. The dog looked very hungry, but he refused to eat the dog food. I couldn't understand what was wrong with him. That evening, little kids were running up and down the street, dressed in their Halloween costumes. It kinda made me wish I wasn't too old for trick-or-treating. So I decided to take the dog for a walk in the forest behind our house. After a while, we came across a group of 3 teenage girls who were camping in the forest. They were planning to have a Halloween party in the woods, and they had brought some food and drinks with them. The girls were around the same age as me, so we chatted for a while. They asked me if I'd like to join them. One of the girls tried to pet the dog, but he just growled at her. He didn't seem to like being touched by anyone. And they were having trouble pitching their tent, so I decided to help them. Between the 4 of us, we managed to set up the tent. I looked around and realized my dog was nowhere to be seen. I asked the girls to help me look for him. By now, it was dark and the stars were out. The moon was pale and full, and the wind was whistling through the trees. We decided to split up into 2 groups. The first 2 girls went off together, and I paired up with the third. We spent a long time looking for my dog, but there was no sign of it. Eventually, we gave up and started back towards the tent. Suddenly, we heard shouts and high-pitched screams echoing through the trees. We ran all the way back to the tent, and when we got there, we found the other 2 girls laying in a pool of blood. They were terribly injured. One of the girls was unconscious, and the other was barely clinging to life. I asked her what happened, and she managed to choke out a few words. She grabbed my arm and stared at me, her eyes wide with fear. She said that they had been attacked by some sort of monstrous creature that emerged from the woods. I tried to ask her more questions, but her grip on my arm slowly relaxed, and she died. The third girl burst into tears and couldn't stop trembling. We looked at each other in disbelief. Neither of us knew what to do. We were terrified, but we didn't want to leave the dead girls lying out there in the grass. We decided to carry them into the tent to protect them from being eaten by wild animals. As we crouched inside the tent, desperately trying to think of what to do, we suddenly heard strange noises outside. For a minute, I didn't know if the sounds were real or if it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. It sounded like a dog yelping in pain. I was worried that it was my dog and he might be injured. Working up my courage, I decided to go outside and see where the noises were coming from. The girl didn't want me to leave her alone, but I assured her I would be right back. Cautiously, I slipped out of the tent and searched the clearing. I crept up to the tree line and peered into the forest, but I couldn't see anything. The night was still and eerily silent. All I could hear was the soft whistling of the wind. When I went back to the tent, I was horrified to find it completely destroyed. Inside, the third girl lay dead. Her body had been ripped apart and partially devoured. A wave of fear washed over me, and I felt weak at the knees. Afraid to stay out in the forest a moment longer, I took off running through the trees, and I didn't stop until I got to the safety of my own house. My parents asked me what was wrong, and when I told them the horrible story, they called the police. Soon, there were flashing lights in our driveway, and 2 police officers were questioning me about what had happened. They went out into the woods and found the dead bodies of the 3 girls laying in the tent. They didn't find my dog anywhere. The policeman said they must have been attacked by wild animals and told me I was lucky to be alive. They said my dog had probably been eaten by the wild animals as well. The next morning, I was out in my backyard when I got the strangest feeling that I was being watched. When I looked up, I saw my dog standing at the forest's edge. He was just standing there staring at me. Then, he did something that terrified me. He stood up on his hind legs, turned around and walked back into the forest. I never saw him again. The lost dog is still out in those woods. Now and then, somebody spots him lurking in the trees. Whenever there is a full moon, I go around our house making sure all the doors and windows are securely locked. Then, I lie in bed and pray for the morning to arrive. During the summer, my friend Steve went mountain climbing. He had lost his footing and fell off the steep cliff face. Luckily, he landed on a ledge and it saved his life. However, he was badly injured and had to be rescued. He hit his head in the fall, and when they brought him to the hospital, he was still unconscious. The doctors examined him and found a swelling in his brain. He had to have surgery immediately. They were in the operating room for hours, and they managed to reduce the swelling, but he was still in a coma. A few days later, he recovered, and I went to visit him in the hospital. He told me that while he was unconscious, he had a very, very strange dream. In the dream, Steve found himself standing in a deserted train station. There was nobody else in sight. When the train pulled into the station, he got on board. There were no other passengers on the train. Steve was completely alone. After a long time, the train started slowing down and it pulled into another station. He looked out the window and saw the platform was deserted. Just then, he heard a low, crackling voice over the intercom. "Next stop. Final stop. Next stop. End of the line." Something about the announcement set a chill down his spine. He jumped out of his seat and managed to get off the train just as the doors were closing. That was the moment when he awoke from the coma. The doctors told him he was lucky to survive. For a while he had been lingering between life and death, they said. While Steve told me about his dream, I could see he was becoming upset and his face was growing pale. I asked him why it troubled him so much, and he said, "What if I hadn't got off at that train station? What would have happened if I'd stayed on the train to the end of the line?" My mom's friend is a woman who lives in South Korea. This happened 10 years ago. She lived with her husband and her young daughter in an apartment building in Seoul. At the time, her husband was always at work during the day and her daughter was very young, so she was a stay-at-home mom. One day the woman went out to run some errands and she took her daughter with her. When they came back, they stood in the lobby of the apartment building and pressed the button for the elevator. When it arrived, the doors opened and she saw that there was a man already in the elevator. He was wearing a yellow raincoat and he also had a yellow hat on his head. The woman got onto the elevator with her daughter and she pressed the button for her floor. Something about the man made her feel uneasy. He never looked up at her. He just kept staring at the floor. It was as if he was keeping his head down so she couldn't really see his face. As the doors closed and the elevator began to ascend, the woman glanced at the man out of the corner of her eye. She noticed that he was carrying something close to his side, something that was wrapped in newspaper. The man was making her nervous. Something about him wasn't right, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. She made her daughter stand on the other side of her. She didn't know why, but she wanted to place herself in between the man and her daughter. There was an uncomfortable silence as the elevator slowly went up, floor by floor. The woman glanced at the elevator buttons and noticed that only one button was lit up. It was the button for her floor. None of the other numbers had been pressed. Things started to click in her head. That's when she realized what it was about the man that was making her so nervous. He was wearing a raincoat, but it wasn't raining outside. The sun had been shining all day. The woman started to panic. She took out her cell phone, and even though her husband was at work, she pretended she was calling him. She started saying things like, "I'm on the elevator and about to get off. Can you open the front door for me?" And making it seem like her husband was waiting at home for her. When the elevator reached her floor and the doors opened, she quickly grabbed her daughter by the hand and got off. She started to walk as fast as she could down the hallway to her apartment. Glancing back, she noticed that the man had also gotten off the elevator on her floor and was slowly following her down the hallway. When she got to her apartment, she started to bang on the door and said loudly, "Hey, I'm home! Open the door!" She even tried to make it seem as if her husband was coming to answer the door. When the man in the yellow raincoat saw this, he stopped in his tracks, turned around, and started walking back towards the elevator. She watched him until he got back on the elevator, and she breathed a sigh of relief. She started to punch in the key code to her door, but her hands were shaking so much she kept hitting wrong numbers. Each time she pushed a button, it made a beeping sound. To her horror, she realized that the elevator doors hadn't closed. The man in the yellow raincoat was still there. He could hear the beeps. That meant he knew that no one was going to answer the door for her. She saw him get out of the elevator and come running down the hallway towards her. The woman let out a scream. She tried one more time and managed to punch in the correct key code. The door opened and she pushed her daughter inside. She jumped through the doorway herself, and when she turned around, she saw that the man in the yellow raincoat was right behind her. She just managed to slam the door in his face before he could wedge his hand into the doorway to block her. Her heart was thumping in her chest, and she quickly locked the front door and peered through the peephole. She saw the man in the yellow raincoat standing at the door with a knife in his hand. As she watched, he stood there for a moment, then calmly turned and walked back towards the elevator. A few months later, the woman was watching television when a news flash came on. It said that police had captured a serial killer named Yu Young Chul. He was responsible for the murder of over 20 young women and old men. After he killed them, he mutilated their bodies and ate parts of them. The woman told my mom that she could never forget the dread she felt when she saw the footage on the news of the serial killer being led away by police. He was still wearing the same yellow raincoat.